There's a moment when polite explanations stop working, when tight housing market and rising interest rates and supply chain issues don't explain why millions of Americans can't afford a roof anymore. And that moment is when you ask the question the country hates the most. Where do they expect us to go? Because if you can't afford to rent, can't afford to buy, or get into public housing or qualify for assistance, shelters are all full, waiting lists are years long, and family lives 3 states away, then what exactly is the plan for survival? No one ever answers that question directly, because the answer is ugly. The reality is this: you're not supposed to go anywhere. You're supposed to quietly disappear. You're supposed to figure it out without being seen. And you're supposed to solve your poverty off camera. You're supposed to decline quietly, starve quietly, freeze quietly.
If you spot this on your bathroom tiles or in your shower, you've got black mold. But don't panic. Here's what to do. Check this out. No scrubbing, no rinse.
Or move until you break. This is why the bans and the ordinances and the regulations that we see all rhyme together. They're not random. They're territorial. They're about containment. If you can't afford a house, well, you're told to go rent. You can't afford rent, you're told to downsize. But downsize where? Tiny homes are heavily regulated. Sheds in some states aren't even legal to live in. RVs and campers can't be parked on your property in some states. Van life is being criminalized in cities, and sleeping in cars is now a misdemeanor. And we all know what happens to tent encampments, don't we? If the apartment is too expensive and the alternatives are illegal, what exactly is the good citizen supposed to do here? The rich call it urban planning. The poor call it displacement. And us seniors, we call it exile. And people act shocked when retirees end up in Walmarts and Cracker Barrel parking lots. But where were they supposed to go? Into the luxury senior community they'll never afford? Into the nursing home that will extract their life savings until Medicaid paperwork clears? Into the shelter full of addiction, chaos, and violence? Into the spare bedroom of children who live paycheck to paycheck? I don't think so. America loves to chant, work hard and you'll be fine. But when hard workers get old, sick, and injured, widowed or laid off, or even priced out like I was, the chant suddenly changes to not here, not in my neighborhood, not in this county, or this parking lot, or under this bridge, not in your van, not in this trailer, not on this land, not in this city. So again, my question stands. Where? Where can the elderly exist? Where can the disabled exist? Where can the poor exist? And where can the displaced exist? So where can anyone exist who doesn't produce enough rent to justify the square footage? Because here's the truth, nobody in city council chambers will say at a microphone. Housing isn't about shelter anymore. It's about yield. And I've covered this in a lot of my earlier episodes. After all, human beings who can't produce yield, they don't get a zone. They end up with citations, or worse, jail. Housing that was once a human right has become a financial instrument, then a speculative casino. Then it became a class filter, and now it's a compliance test. You see, if you can pay, well, then you can stay. But if you can't, you better move on. But again, move where? After all, they look at it as, well, that's not their problem. The cruelty isn't just that the system doesn't care. The cruelty is that the system here doesn't feel obligated to answer the question in the first place. So how did the last resort become illegal? Well, that's a good question. You see, when the rent is too high and the mortgage is out of reach and the waiting lists are closed and all the shelters are full, people do what human beings have always done when backed into a corner. They improvise, they adapt, they overcome. They downsize, convert, share, repurpose. They live smaller, or they live different. And this is not chaos. This is what I call resilience. And that's exactly why the system hates it the most. Because every time the poor or the elderly invent a workaround, it threatens the one thing the system worships above all else: compliance through dependency. And I've covered this in several of my earlier episodes. After all, you look at the list of last resort survival options that have exploded over the last 20 years. Tiny homes, shed and cabin conversions, van and RV living, trailer parks and manufactured homes, or multi-generational housing, rooming houses, car camping, and rural lots with off-grid setups like mine. All of these have one thing in common here. They allow people to survive cheaper than the market wants them to. And that can't be allowed. So instead of fixing the housing crisis, America chose the easier solution. Let's criminalize the alternatives. Tiny homes, some are banned, others are restricted by minimum square footage, requirements designed for McMansions and not for survival here. Sheds converted to cabins? Well, no. Suddenly they require residential zoning, permits, septic inspections, and electrical certifications. And it defeats the entire purpose of the building cheap. RVs and campers on your own land? That's illegal in a large part of this country. And not because it's unsafe, but because it violates community standards. Well, that's code for property values. And van living, we've all seen on YouTube what's going on with that. You get ticketed, towed, impounded, or banned, and no overnight sleeping, of course. Car camping, that's even getting worse. Criminalized from coast to coast through curfews and parking bans. Trailer parks, well, they're turning them into luxury apartments on the land. Boarding houses and rooming houses are regulated out of existence for decades under zoning that forbids unrelated adults from living together. And of course, we have shared housing among seniors, often blocked by zoning restrictions that pretend to be about safety, but are really about aesthetics, let's face it. And when people finally pitch tents because there is nothing left at all, well, cities order police to clear the encampments for public health, as if homelessness is an infection instead of a policy outcome. And let's watch the sequence play out here. First, they price you out, then they ban the alternatives, then they criminalize your survival, and then they ask you why you're homeless. Sounds about right. Then they blame you for it. You see, this is not incompetence. This is what I call boundary enforcement. The poor are allowed to exist, just not here, not in view, not where real estate investors can see them, and not where property values might notice, and not where some neighborhoods where they think denial is fragile. And here's the saddest part. The people getting squeezed are the reckless, the irresponsible, or the lazy. They're the people who played by the rules their entire lives. Retired union workers in 20-year-old RVs. Seniors who paid off a modest home only to lose it to taxes or medical bills. Widows living in vans to stretch a small Social Security check. Disabled adults making $900 a month in cities where parking costs more than the rent used to. Working poor families and campers who would love an apartment, but they don't meet that 3 times the income requirement. And I'm sure some of my people here watching can share their own experiences in the comments below. I know I'm going to see some. I mean, here's my final thought. We pretend the housing crisis is about affordability. But affordability is just the surface problem here. The deeper problem is that the system decided there are correct ways to live, and being poor is not one of them. You see, it's not enough to survive. You must survive in a way that is aesthetically pleasing and profitable to the people in charge of the land. And that's what makes the bans make sense, because alternative housing threatens the market, the yield, the narrative, and it threatens the illusion of national prosperity. Because if millions of people started living cheaply, openly, and successfully outside the sanctioned housing system, the lie would collapse overnight. Which brings me back to the question I asked earlier. If these forms of survival are banned, then where exactly is the person supposed to go? Because the society that outlaws the last resort isn't confused. It's eliminating the options. I hope you've enjoyed today's episode, and I look forward to seeing you again tomorrow for part 2. So until then, folks, let's rise together.